Welcome, one and all, to another episode of the Monte and Wolf Show. Also, a glorious celebration of KT Rolster and their final victory in the telecom war, which the last time it happened, I looked this up, Wolf, was January 24th, 2021.
Yeah, it was my
been,
first telecom war as an LCK caster.
It was in week 2. It was your second week of League of Legends casting.
Yeah.
And KT managed to vanquish T1 2-1. Although KT ended up being 7th that season. And they did have such notable players such as Hybrid, UCal, Dove in the mid lane. They actually had Noah as an AD carry on that roster, who is now on Fnatic, so that's a little bit interesting. And Doran was up in the top lane. Oh, Doran. How you have been upgraded by Kiin in the year of our Lord 2023.
So
that was a different era.
That was the season. Well, everyone who watched back then will definitely remember that was like the year of Teddy and Gumar swapping. We have 10-man roster on T1. Like, what roster are we even using? Like, what is even happening? And
also Cuzz was on T1 at that time.
That was the season I put. Yeah, that's true. I put I think in my power rankings T1 at like 4th, but going into that season, and everyone was like, "No, they're gonna win. They have so many good players." I'm like, they have too many good players. And then T1 ended up losing to KT at that time, and that was one of the big warning signs I remember early in that season. We were like, "Oh man, this KT roster is not great," but T1 lost to them. There are problems. They bounced back a little bit, but this is a very different scenario here with KT Rolster. This is KT Rolster potentially being the best team in the LCK. And
as predicted on the Monte and Wolf Show. As predicted here first.
We told you guys. We
even,
by the way, everyone was like, I mean, I told everyone too. I was doubling down on it, walking around the studio. I predicted KT as you know, and most people actually did predict KT, unsurprisingly. But I was telling everyone, if it's not a 2-0, like, just come call me and gloat, because I was so ready for the 2-0 for KT to win it, because I just thought they were by far the stronger team. And then there was some close moments, and KT was happy gaming a little bit in that series, but ultimately T1 defeated themselves in that one, in that second game, I will say. But I mean, it's a good look if you're a KT fan right now. This team is so strong. I think they have the most depth of strategy. They can play through bottom side. They can play through mid. They can play through top. Cuzz is arguably the best jungler right now in the LCK. I would say he is. You know, Owner's form has kind of been up and down. Canyon and Owner peak higher sometimes, I guess you could say, but the consistent form we're seeing from Cuzz is definitely there. And if Doran was a functional top laner who didn't make huge mistakes and lose lane for no reason all the time, I'd still feel confident to say that GenG was the better team. But because he doesn't play very well all the time, you don't know what you're going to get with Doran. I feel like it's not an outrageous thing to say that right now KT is the best performing team in the LCK. And I think they have the widest, berth of strategies they can pull from. And BD is playing different from everybody else right now. He's playing different champions. He's playing roaming mids. He's playing Talia. He's playing Twisted Fate. And Chovy will get it done on Ahri. He'll pick Ahri again and get it done. But I'm just saying, I think KT is pushing us forward into something else.
Well, I think that there's a lot of flavor differences between the top teams in this league right now, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But I do have to give a shout out to T1 fans first, Wolf, because in our inaugural match of the week for Last Free Nation, where I pick which match on Esports Bet is going to give people a 10% bonus if they get it right, I picked T1 versus KT. And the T1 fans were so crazy, Wolf, that they pushed the line of KT winning up to over 3 at times. I got it at 2.8, but some people got it over at 3. So this is an excellent time, by the way, guys, to head on over to Esports Bet. And if you use our referral link, which you will find below, you can get an extra 10% if you do our match of the week, which will be C9 versus EG this week. And wait, if you sign up, you still get a 50% deposit bonus. up to $200. And you also are able, if you don't want the deposit bonus, you can have $100 risk-free bet for your first bet. If you mess it up on your first bet, you can just go in and say, hey, go to their Discord, talk to them. They'll credit it back to your account. It really is an excellent time. If you had used it this past week and taken the crazy odds on KT, you would be way up right now. And you'd have an additional 10% up to $100 USDT. So you can only get that 10% can only be worth up to $100 USDT. And it has to be your first wager, guys, on the match. First wager on the match of the week. You can't just do it 10 times, right? Obviously.
Yeah. I mean, the
Anyway,
good news
continue.
doesn't end, on the esports bet stuff. And well, we did this a lot, obviously, during Worlds last year, where we were tracking some of the odds and seeing like where people's heads were at versus what the reality was. And yeah, for T1, those numbers get pretty crazy. But when I heard, because I heard about it when it was like at 2.7, someone told me about it before the match started, and I was like, free money for anyone who gets in on that.
Dude, I mean, like, usually it's outrageous, Wolf, but it's not usually this outrageous because you and I had KT as a favorite coming in, and usually you could get some crazy odds, and then maybe somebody defeats T1. But honestly, when T1's been on, they've been so consistent. Last spring 18-0, this spring 17-1. So it has been hard sometimes to get those odds to work in your favor because T1's been good enough to close it out. But we're not gonna see that. That's not the current reality for KT. So as long as this holds,
yeah, I think it's also a combination of KT being pretty bad for the last 2.5 years too. Like, I think people, I mean, okay, I won't say 2.5 because they were very good in spring as well.
Yeah, come on, man.
But like, as we've mentioned, they haven't beaten T1 in 2.5 years. So until now. So I mean, I guess if you're kind of a casual watcher and you haven't really been paying attention to the subtleties of the LCK, if you're a Monte Wolf Show watcher, we got you here. Don't worry. We'll make sure you got your head on straight. But I can see some people who just casually look at the team rosters and look at what's happened over the last few years and go like, oh yeah, of course T1 wins that one. They always win that one. But not this time. And
look, this year and even last year when KT was worse, these matches have been extremely close. I mean, think back to the spring playoffs where arguably, we said this last week, KT probably should have won. They mega threw game 5 in that series. And even though T1 has come out on top, they have been really hard fought, and KT has had very legitimate chances to win all of those matches. And here, they just got it fucking done. They just clapped T1. Yeah. And it didn't look particularly close.
What was that other telecom more last year too, where aiming was on Kaisa and he made that big mistake in the later team fight. Not to say that necessarily like they would have won that game if he didn't, but we've had a lot of 3-game telecom wars over the last few. So T1's always come out on top, but they have played T1 incredibly close. So do we want to talk about the rise of KT first? Are we just going to start?
Yes.
Are we gonna... Okay.
Let's talk about the glorious rise of KT, because this was the KT test week, guys. This is when they played T1, which we've been discussing. They also played Dplus KIA, right? So they are up against a couple of the top teams in the league. Arguably, the last one that they haven't faced yet is going to be Hanwha Life, which they will not face until, I think, their last game of the round robin?
Yeah.
Oh no, they already faced Hanwha. Just kidding. Ignore me, guys. They beat.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that was that was a really weird series. That one went 3. So, that was the opening series of the tournament.
Yeah. So KT, they've got Kwangdong, Nongshim, and OK Savings Bank Breon left. So I think we could probably assume that they're going to do a pretty clean sweep of these teams as well. But I think, we should talk about what we saw this past week, because you intimated it earlier, but the Twisted Fate came back out this week in both of their best of 3s in game 2. And it's something that BDD has looked really good on. He has been prioritizing a lot of these roaming mid laners, whether it's the Talia, like you mentioned, the Annie, and he's been doing excellent with them overall. So it really has been about BDD buttressing the side lanes and working well with Cuzz. And then depending on where they've got pressure and advantages, or they have like kind of draft edges, that tends to be where they end up shuttling those resources to, right?
Yeah.
But we've also seen some really interesting depth of picks in the top lane because we've talked about Kiin's versatility. Like he's the only good Malphite player really within the LCK. There are a few in LPL guys, but he's the only really good one in Korea right now. But then we also get to see picks like, oh, Kana, you want your Renekton that was undefeated this year up until last week? Well, we'll give you another loss this week. You know, yeah, you had the substitute in that last game, but we're going to go ahead and pick Quinn into it, a classic Renekton counter pick. And we'll take you out that way and we'll play into the Quinn, play into the split pushing. Of course, Static Shiv coming in, going to be amazing with the split pushing Quinn. So we see more and more of these Static Shiv champions start to appear.
And that Quinn game was really interesting because I thought that it was going to be really hard for KT to close it out because they had a massive lead, right? Like 8,000 gold at one point, something like that. I can't remember the exact number, but it was massive. But a lot of that was on the Quinn. And then they lost a few team fights. And it wasn't like they got wiped, but they lost control of Baron. They had to back away, stuff like that. And this Aurelion Sol on the other side was scaling, right? And I thought that Aurelion Sol was a really cool pick into what KT put together because A, it's basically saying, I can, in the late game, always out-team fight you, always out-damage you. I'm going to scale way better, and the ultimate is going to have such a high impact into KT's comp. And it also allows you to match the roams of the Talia to a certain extent, right? It's not like Aurelion Sol can Weaver's Wall down, but he can get involved in these fights and skirmishes, and the longer the fights go, the more power he gets. So if KT try to dive, for example, and fail, and it gets to be a longer exchange, Showmaker's going to do a ton of damage in those moments and potentially pick up some big kills, which happened once in that game. And then later on, though, KT, the way they operated team fights was just so incredible because you have Kiin on the Quinn constantly threatening the backline, pushing either Kana out on the Renekton or actually trying to push Showmaker out, even then putting the threat onto Depth Solution, constantly basically playing this Quinn because he was so ahead like an assassin. And Quinn can functionally be like that in a composition, but he could just blow people up because he's so fed. And then he's rejoining the fight, BDD's Talia walls, cutting Dplus in half, making it so they can't actually collapse in and get any value out of that Aurelion Sol. And it felt like this was a composition that they had prepared, and they knew they could play into a Renekton comp. They knew that Renekton would be prioritized by Dplus because Kana loves to play this pick. And they just came in going, yeah, we're going to play this thing that we've got in our back pocket. We're going to execute it well. And it wasn't just like Kiin being like, yo, let me play Quinn today. This will be fun. It really just didn't feel like that. It felt like they had an entire, extremely detailed plan. And that's what you love to see in a series like this against a team that's known for unique drafting in D+.
Yeah, and I think it was really cool to see the versatility of KT between their two matches because Kiin is playing more aggressive picks in the Renekton and Quinn in the first series against D+, and by the time he gets to T1, well, here comes this tank play with Gragas and Malphite. And they were just extremely good at neutralizing the threats, and this is the versatility that we're seeing from KT right now. As you noted, I think BDD is kind of playing the same and really focusing on these kind of roaming style of champions. But where they allocate and which side lane they allocate resources to is really up to how the draft plays out and how the game plays out, and has allowed them to really, push aiming ahead in the early game. And I think that I've seen a lot of kind of weird criticism of aiming, but I think he had some statement games this week. I mean, he died once against T1 in 2 games, and he was decisively stomping in some of these bot lane skirmishes.
I've been kind of an aiming enjoyer for a long time, basically since he joined the LCK. And I will also be the first one to admit that there have been some bad moments for aiming. There have been some weeks for this guy. And I think he may have solo thrown the Gen.G series on Ezreal in the losers final of the LCK playoffs, and then obviously he bought Static Shiv, which was illegal, which is like something that I'm not going to get into again on this show. But the guy has been phenomenal when he's given resources, and KT will give him resources. I feel like there's this like narrative and this lie that like is being perpetrated on the internet that KT only wins because of Kiin, and that like Kiin is given all the attention that he pops off. But like that's true maybe like 60% of the time, but the other 40%, they're either playing through BDD getting advantages bottom side, or just straight up Cuzz is getting aiming ahead, and aiming is laning well, getting massively fed, and then popping off in the mid game super early and playing an incredible series. Like this happens so many times where aiming is actually the main character, and I don't know why
Yeah.
people don't trust him. I don't know why people don't like him. I don't know why people say KT don't play around him, because they absolutely do all
Yeah,
the time.
let me throw some stats out to help you here, Wolf. Okay, so BDD, by the way, guys, right now has the lowest damage percent on his team of any mid laner. He has the lowest damage percent after 15 minutes of any mid laner. He has the second lowest CS percentage after 15 minutes, behind Faker, who obviously has been famously low economy, right? Now, in spite of that, he has some of the best laning stats. So he's actually second in lane at gold difference per 10 behind Faker, coincidentally. But he has been doing very, very well, but he hasn't been doing it with hardly any resources. And the reason why I bring this up is that aiming is basically the highest damage, highest economy player within the league at AD carry. He gets the most damage. He does nearly a third, 32.3% of his team's damage after 15 minutes. He has the highest earned gold per minute, and he gets the highest behind Vital, right, of team CS after, or percentage after 15 minutes. So this guy, he is performing, guys. They are investing a lot of money, a lot of resources into aiming, but he is also delivering by converting those resources into the highest damage percentages for an AD carry player in the league. And a lot of this is coming as a sacrifice for BDD, but BDD is the one who's setting up all of these fights, positioning on the Twisted Fate, creating the pick opportunities, and, you know, the cleanups going to aiming, and also to Cuzz, who plays a lot of Viego.
Yeah, I mean, it's because BDD is also playing these mid champions that are facilitators, right, and more supportive roles a lot of the time. And sometimes it can be initiation, sometimes it could be, warping a team fight with a Weaver's Wall, or just one big Azir ult, right? If he ever gets to play it, because it's taken away from him so often. But it's really that he isn't the main character, BDD. It's aiming, and Kiin sets him up, and Kiin warps the rest of the map because he always has topside prio for these early objectives, because he's playing these picks where he can hard carry the matchup, get super far ahead, put the enemy top laner down, so the enemy top laner is less impactful in those early game fights because he's significantly behind. And aiming is playing both sides of the AD carry spectrum. Like he's playing early game picks where he's getting advantages, like his Draven, for example, getting ahead on that, and then pushing into massive leads that way. Well, he's also playing, late game scaling picks as well. So, I mean, this is why I'm saying this team doesn't have any hardcore weaknesses, right? Like this team doesn't have any weak points right now where you look at it and go, well, the KT is not really good at, X, Y, Z, or any specific type of composition right now. And on the other side of things, this has been a bit of a controversial take, and I've gotten a lot of flack for it, and people still won't stop like sending me messages about this. But I said Deft isn't empowered the same way that aiming is on his team, and I still feel that's true. I mean, Deft, for example, is a great AD carry player, but he isn't empowered by T+ KIA right now. And Dplus KIA have a lot of issues on the top side of the map, and I think that is kind of warping how things go, and Deft's having to play a harder game because of it. But at the same time, I'm looking at how Guma is empowered oftentimes, and how T1 has played around him in the past, and he isn't even finding the same level of success right now that aiming is, when T1 historically have played almost exclusively through Guma UC. So the fact that they can play through also Kiin and find these results means that, when you're drafting against KT, do you target aiming? No, you can't do that. Do you target Kiin? No. Do you target BDD, who has such an insanely wide champion pool? Like, what's your angle? It's hard to prep for this team, even because they have such a versatile set of ways they can get both the top and bottom side ahead. And BDD, I guarantee you he'll play Galio. He just will do it. He just doesn't care.
Well, I also think that that's really the power of KT right now, is it feels that they just have the flexibility to kind of carry through any position. And as for BDD's stats would be higher if teams would let him fucking play Azir, but they won't. They just take it away or ban it from him because he's too good. Right. So what happens with BDD is that in the process of attempting to ban against KT, he ends up with one of Annie, Talia, or Twisted Fate, because you're having to drop a kind of priority ban in the meta oftentimes in order to target the Azir, right? Or you're having to target Kiin in some way, shape, or form, or you feel like, oh, we have to ban Nico if we're going to be on red side in this game, but then maybe we also have to ban Azir and Annie, which is the first round of bans that Dplus did against T1, for example. And then you're also having to kind of suss out, okay, do we want to play the Azir? Because T1 started by banning the Azir on blue side, and then they ended up picking it on the blue side instead. And you try and ban out Cuzz, take away the Vi or the Sejuani, but then he just ends up with Viego anyway. And that has been extremely good for KT just because of their strength in running these pick compositions.
Yeah, I'm looking at Cuzz's stats right now. He's 6-0 on Viego. He's 6-0. He's 3-1 on Sejuani. So those are his primary two picks. Those are 10 out of his 14 games he's played. Maybe that's how teams should try to target ban KT at this point. I mean, they do often take the Sejuani away. That's something that teams have learned about KT over the last few weeks, especially the last week in general. But Cuzz is playing so well with BDD that they become this kill squad that can impact top lane or bottom lane because they're always chaining CC, whether it's Viego W after a gold card, for example, in that T1 series, or you're following up with Sejuani for any setup that BDD has had, or you're Sejuani ulting, the BDD is pulling somebody back with Talia. So this duo is so strong, and they're pushing it around, the entire map, and then they're pushing it into late game, and then they're warping team fights with that. So, and then when you have Aiming having so much gold, right, he's got the items to actually pop off in front to back, so they can play pick or front to back, in these compositions. So there's just so much flexibility, and I think that Gen.G has very similar caliber of players right now, and arguably, I would say Pays is better than Aiming. I would say that Chovy is better than BDD individually, but their teamwork and their setup it means that they need to be, basically, if you know what I mean. Like Chovy needs to be better than BDD, and Pays needs to be better than Aiming on an individual level, because in terms of team fight coordination and how they're working with their drafts, it's not always the same level of coordination as KT. Now, they have had some fantastic series in terms of coordination, like that T1 series, right, where Doran was insanely behind, and then you have Peanuts engages, Doran's following up. And sometimes you look at that at Gen.G and go, man, this team is so clean with their team fighting. But I feel like it hasn't been always, right? And especially look at Gen.G's series, second series of this week, where it was a little bit rocky at times. That being said, I'm really looking forward to Gen.G versus KT in round robin too, because we kind of got robbed in the first round robin of that series actually coming through the way it was supposed to. And now, we might find out which one of these teams actually is the best, especially just even in the matchup.
Yeah, it was also, I think, if we look at it, it was also in the first week of competition, and KT had a day off after playing Hanwha, and it was Gen.G's first match. Now, Gen.G also had a tough week against both T1 and KT, it must be said. And they did probably deserve to lose to T1, but it was also on a different patch, and that was before some of these Azir buffs came through, which is one of the things that has made KT super dangerous. So I do think that, I mean, we'll see what how the patches shake out and which patch we're actually on by the time the rematch occurs, because that is going to be what? Let me just look real quick.
I think it's in the middle of the second round robin.
Yeah, it's going to be a few weeks. It's going to be on July 21st, so about a month from now.
Yeah.
Is when so we don't know what patch will end up being on right now. So
it's another week for KT also, where they face Dplus and Gen.G in the same week. So see how they do.
Well, maybe Dplus isn't that big of a deal. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, I think in general, though, the difference with KT also is that they rarely get caught out of position and punished because their vision and macro have been so solid. And if you have to make a complaint about Gen.G, it's that they can frequently overextend, especially Peanut, and randomly die in some of these games, which does cause losses. And that's been true even throughout the spring split that they ended up winning, right? Is that Peanut would famously just kind of randomly int and throw games, and his teammates would kind of follow up by one inting behind him at times, and that was one of their biggest issues. They also just fundamentally don't have some of the same kind of brain farts in the laning phase that Doran has had,
Yeah.
which you give Kiin those advantages, and it as we've talked about before, it is very, very difficult to make a comeback against Kiin because he is a player that is truly amazing right now, and he is just punishing anything you do to him to the nth degree, and he just won't throw back a lot of the time.
Yeah. And
I mean,
when
he
I
didn't even
imagine,
die in the T1 series as a tank.
yeah, when I imagine Doran playing against Kiin again right now, I just think like, well, that's just free money. Like I don't even know if they have to put resources into Kiin. He could just do it by himself, you know. He's a very punishing top laner, so I am right now feeling very good about KT's chances of going to Worlds as maybe one of our top 2 seeds. Like I know it's still early in the season, and we've been talking about how we've wanted to see another LCK team go to Worlds. It's been a long time since we've had KT there. And I think it might actually be the year where it's happening. It might actually happen. It's not like what if KT makes the Hail Mary run through? What if they're better than Dplus? What if they're better than, XYZ weaker team? What if they're better than DRX? They should be better than DRX, but they don't go. Like this is actually going to be a moment where we're not like, are we going to send a 4th seed that's very weak? Like, and it's going to be KT, like maybe KT's chance. No. It's going to be KT coming in as one of our stronger seeds, I think, this time around. It just really feels that way at this moment in time. Now, we could see some big meta changes come through and KT fall off, but I can't predict that right now either because their playstyle is so versatile that even if, some specific champions get changed, they can continue to play the style. Kiin will always be able to find counterpicks. He's got a massive champion pool. So I'm more worried about other teams, to be frank, about meta changes than I am about KT.
Yeah, I think that there are some arguments to so probably Azir is going to get nerfed with his current power level in the professional scene right now, which will obviously hurt KT. Annie also, probably going to continue to be
I hope
dialed
so.
back.
Please.
Yeah, but so I mean, there are some questions just about what happens after that. I think TF and Talia are unlikely to be messed with right now. Sejuani's another pick that I think will probably end up getting nerfed down the road. And so, what happens if Cuzz has to play something that isn't by Sejuani or Viego because his fallback has been Volibear, which has been kind of unique to him. It's been played a couple other times in LCK, but it was a pick that he came out with. And I'm not sure that's really the best right now. But he also hasn't been showing, the Kindred or the Kha'Zix or some of these other carry junglers that have been popular, particularly with Gen.G, who has a 100% win rate, surprisingly, with Peanut on the Kha'Zix.
Yeah, I wonder if he'll end up playing the Rek'Sai because it didn't happen. It only happened one time in the LCK yesterday, but we haven't seen Cuzz play the Rek'Sai just yet. And yeah, it's a pick that I think is a little bit more niche right now. So something he could go with. And like I do think all of those champions are very much tied with Cuzz's identity right now, and I think all of them are very strong and like probably should see a nerf. But I don't think that it's all going to happen at the same time. Where Riot's like, by the way, I'm nerfing Cuzz. We're going to nerf all these at the same time. They're all really strong, and also the Annie and the Azir at the same time. Like, I think it will be a slow trickle down of as these champions kind of slowly get nerfed and get changed, and obviously other champions could get introduced. And we have that new champion come through. I don't know if it's going to be when it's releasing. Probably happen towards the latter half of the season. That could be a pick that he plays. Seems like an assassin. Don't know if it's a jungle pick yet, but anyway, I'm not worried. Even though KT is abusing a lot of the strong champions, that's just what a good team does, And Cuzz of Sejuani uniquely pairs very well with Kiin's aggressive top champions, but it's banned against him all the time now, and he's still making the Viego work. And Viego has been a pick in the LCK that's kind of like, oh, it's Viego Ari, and that's kind of how it goes, like for most teams. But he's doing it without the Ari. He's doing it without that pre-baked in synergy a lot of the time, and that's very impressive to see. He's doing it with Twisted Fate. He's like, yeah, we'll play TF here.
Yeah, it's been really entertaining. So at least on this patch, KT looking like they will reign supreme. And I at least in aiming, I have a certain level of confidence because if we go back to the Ezreal times, we know aiming can handle that as well. And he's
Kaisa.
also been Kaisa fine. He's also not a slouch when it comes to some more aggressive picks. We've seen his Draven over the last couple splits do extremely well also. So it really is. It feels like less about the picks and more that KT just has a very good sense of strategy right now and comms because they're adapting so well in the game to where they apply pressure based on the champions that they have and how they play through their winning lanes. And that knowledge probably isn't going to go away even in a meta shift.
Yeah, I don't see it happening. And I mean, I don't know what else I could say good about KT because like they've shown in the games
maybe
we've
Cuzz
spent
will
30
fall
minutes
off. It
about it.
does seem a little sus that Cuzz is like this consistently good.
I don't know, but I mean it does, but it also makes you wonder like and when you look at T1 using Cuzz so long and trying to get value out of this player for such a long period of time, Longzhu as well. And you think back to some of his heyday moments like years ago, and then teams continued to prioritize him even though he fell off in a big way. Like everybody knows Cuzz really took a dip over the last few years. And now he's back to form again, and it's like, well, these teams were believing in him for a reason. Clearly the scrim results were good, the tests and the tryouts were good, and now that he's got a team that really listens to him and trusts him, he's shot back up to being a top jungler again. And Cuzz age-wise isn't old, but in terms of his career, like he is quite old. Like all of these KT players have been around the block. Like this is, not a team that's warped around rookies. Like we've seen T1 has all these young players, right? You bring Owner in, Zeus, etc., and then like they were okay. I got Faker and the new guys and the young people. This is like BDD, and also we're all old. We've all been playing this for a long time, and that's really cool to me, and I think inspiring for the future of the LCK, where we do have some strong rookie prospects, right? But look at LCK challengers, and there are some really strong players there, but nobody who stands out. There's no Zeus right now who's popping up, and everyone's trying to grab this young kid, right, and pick him up. We're not seeing a whole lot of that right now. So if KT can make this roster work, then there's a lot of older players who have been around for a long time and people say are washed that maybe on the right team actually could become great again. And KT just feels like the perfect storm of experience and decisive shot calling, and I'm excited. I'll just say it,
You don't have to be excited. Again, it was written that they are going to win. The prophecy is set. There's no excitement. There's only just witnessing it unfold and basking in its glory. As for T1, I am a bit surprised that they were this lackluster. Obviously, we expected a more competitive series out of them, and it felt kind of like it was just a bad day for T1. I don't think we're going to see this poor level of poor performance across the board again.
I don't think so. I think, I want to look back at that second draft. It was a Kha'Zix draft for KT, or for T1 rather, in the KT series where they had a lead. And then they took some really bad fights. And also, more than KT, or rather more than T1 through that game, there was like a really clutch play from BDD where they get the gold card onto Owner and actually lock him down and kill him. They got a second kill somewhere else. I can't remember exactly where, but there were 2 kills they picked up after their deficit, and they got all the momentum back, started winning team fights, starting to be able to play around aiming again. And then aiming went 11-1 in that game. So it just feels like the way that T1 found an angle, they couldn't actually hold on to it. They got too haphazard, let's say, with their play. And we said it last week, and I feel like this hasn't really changed for me this week either, is that T1 just, they don't look like they're on the same page. They don't seem like and they were the team that was on the same page more than anyone else for so long that I don't know what's going on internally with this roster, because it hasn't been like sweeping meta changes that makes them irrelevant. It's not anything like that. It's just they're not playing as well as they have in the past, and it doesn't make them a bad team. But when you're up against elite teams like Gen.G and KT, you might stumble if you can't actually play to your highest level every time. And I think we're seeing some issues with Owner. Like I think he's been very inconsistent, but I think the haters are a little bit strong on this, because I think that he has had a few bad games here and there. He's had a few bad moments, but he's still a pretty consistent top jungler.
Yeah, he also has been carrying pretty hard out of the jungle at times. He's had some incredibly good Poppy games this split. So I was a little bit surprised to see the hate against Owner after this series, just because I think you nailed on it earlier, is that Owner's been more inconsistent than Cuzz, but just like Canyon, he's had some really high highs, and a lot of the impetus for carrying this split has been shouldered, I think, by Owner. Like he has been a major threat on champions like Kha'Zix and Kindred at times. So I wouldn't say that this is really an indication that he needs to be replaced.
No,
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that I've said it so many times, but I mean, it does seem inevitable this roster will change in some way next year, and of course, inevitably, as a result, whoever gets pulled out and moves somewhere else, and then someone else comes in, people will assume that means that they were the problem. That's what everyone's decided, but that's not always how it works. Sometimes, the best player wants to leave, because they're like, well, I want to actually see what I could do elsewhere. Like Ruler leaving Gen.G, for example, he left not because he was the problem. He left because he wanted to actually go do something else and try working with a different roster. Hey, it's going pretty well for him so far. But yeah, I think that T1 have some internal problems potentially and some synergy problems that need to be worked out because they're not a weak team and they're probably still on track to go to Worlds, I would say, at this point. Like, I think they're on pace for it. But will they perform well there? Will they actually give us confidence they can maybe make another finals run? Right now I'm not confident. Right now it looks like it's a Gen.G KT finals at the moment. So
Yeah.
it's still early days, but I mean, I think
Yeah.
T1 can turn the season around. And it's weird because I don't even want to overanalyze T1 in this moment because I just know they're capable of more. You've seen this roster in a very similar meta do more, and they're not doing it now. And it's almost like that's as deep as it goes for me. We're not seeing huge draft mistakes. I didn't like the Kha'Zix that much in that KT series in particular. Like, if we want to be really picky, but
I think
it's
it's really
just
hard to play
form.
Kha'Zix in late or in mid game scenarios where you're trying to get vision against a Viego, Malphite, and Twisted Fate, and you're just
Yeah.
going to get completely crowd controlled, targeted, blown up. Credit to Kiin though, also, because another weird thing that I saw from fans was they were trying to. I saw some comments about Faker and Gumayusi being grouped when Kiin was Malphite ulting, and I went and looked at some of those instances in particular, and really it was KT's vision control where he would be in Fog of War, standing on a pink ward, and then he would flash ult over a wall when they didn't know where he was. So, not sure that was really their fault a lot of the time. It was just like really good vision play and decisive engages from Kiin that got the advantages that they had. It wasn't
Also,
like
Faker had
they
Crown.
could see
Like,
him. Yeah, that was terrible.
he
The
had
crown was
Crown, so
really
he,
bad.
he thought, I guess maybe I don't die here. He was wrong, but yeah, I mean, that game was again better for KT than it was bad for T1. It's just they're a top team. They have the caliber of players to be in top 4 in the LCK and probably will end up being top 3. But if I'm gonna predict them to beat Gen.G next time or to beat KT next time, I need to see something more than this. And I'm just gonna keep waiting for that at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I think also the lack of Zeri play, convincing Zeri play, and it's not that they haven't played Zeri this split because they have, but it just Gumayusi never looks comfortable on it, and they never want to play it against good teams is really the issue. And without being able to have that Zeri in your back pocket, it's really difficult in this meta to be able to convincingly carry through the bot side. And then that question comes, well, who is carrying on this roster? And the answer is not Faker with Crown Azir. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that ain't it. Right? Or Faker with Proto Belt Zonia's Nico. He's an engaged tool, but at that point, if the Kha'Zix or the Kindred aren't carrying and Gumayushi's behind or doesn't have the hyper scaling 80 carry pick, it presents a lot of problems for T1 as to how you even deal damage in the mid and late game.
Yeah. It's It's fundamentally, I think, an issue of these players in the drafts that we're seeing aren't being empowered correctly, and this is like exactly why, in my opinion, we saw T1 and GenG struggle at MSI. Is at that time T1, I would say, did a better job overall than GenG did, but at the end maybe GenG actually doing it better for pays, but not setting up their AD carries for success and not actually playing around their carries as well as we saw the supportive roles coming through from the LPL teams in BLG and JDG. And this is an issue that I think a lot of LCK teams are figuring out and solving. I think GenG looks much better at playing around pays right now. I think the same is true of KT and aiming, right? And obviously they weren't at MSI, but I think this has kind of been a clear theme of improvement we have seen in the LCK is teams starting to make sure they can empower their carries in team fights and not leaving them by the wayside, just making sure that, for example, if you're playing Nautilus, you're not always engaging. Sometimes you actually just stand next to the AD carry and ult the guy who's going to come towards your AD carry and then kind of slowly push you and play more slowly. I think the LCK has always kind of been over the last few years a go in only. We go in, we engage, we initiate, we fight, and then the best defense for our AD carry is actually just a hard engage where they have to peel back and then our AD carry follows. And I think we're learning that that's not always, you don't always have to play it that way.
We want to talk about Gen.G and Dplus a little bit this week because those are the other big matches that occurred. Next week, guys, by the way, is we're going to catch up with Hanwha Life, who hasn't had meaningful matches in the last couple of weeks, and they will be playing Dplus and Gen.G. So we'll get a better sense as to if they are actually better than T1 or Dplus KIA. They're probably not better than T1, but might be better than Dplus KIA. But luckily, we get that matchup right on Wednesday of this week, so should be exciting. But for now, looking at we talked about how this is going to be a big test for Dplus as they faced against both KT and Gen.G. We accurately predicted that the matchup versus Gen.G would be probably closer than people anticipated, just because this matchup always seems to play down to the wire. Even in the spring of this year, when Gen.G, or the summer of last year rather, when Gen.G was on a run, and yeah, we've had some players swapped out on Dplus, but the core remains the same and was arguably upgraded from last year.
Yeah. So I think the core talking point in this series is Deft played Aphelios. It happened, for a long time we were just not going to do that. But he actually played it, and he played it twice, and he played it with Yuumi. And Pays tried the Tristana response, which we're seeing a little bit more now after this. Like, he was the first person to try playing this, and while it did work once, it went 1-on-1. I didn't really like the Tristana response. I thought it was a little bit lackluster. It didn't get enough power in lane, and even with the Milio to give it extra range, it wasn't the same sort of power, and it didn't give Pays the type of AD carry agency that he normally has, where he can actually just kind of be the fountain laser, right, and kind of space well and do massive amounts of damage. Tristana is more of an all-in type AD carry in that she can blow somebody up very quickly. She scales very well. Then she gets a jump reset. She jumps on top of another person, and then she blows them up, right? And if you're winning really hard. And in game one, he didn't get huge advantages in the lane, but started to pop off in some skirmishes that Dplus should not have opted into. And then he got fed, and then he popped off. Second game, not so much. I didn't find that same sort of success, didn't find that same sort of agency. Dplus played a lot safer in the second game, and so his Tristana pick didn't work out there. And then he swapped over in the third game to Zeri, because that was left open for them. And they were just like, yeah, let's play Zeri Rakan, doesn't matter. And that's how they ended up taking the series. It wasn't a clean one by any means. Like, the comments, not online, but the comments from us, like the casters, when we were watching that series together, we were all kind of going, okay, well, this is not a clean series, from either team. I think game one was very close, or rather very clean for Gen.G in the end, ultimately, with the lead that they got in the mid game from those skirmishes. Game two, very messy for both sides. And then game three, it was just Dplus being so ahead that it didn't ultimately matter. Like, that game felt like it wasn't even a game, because they ended up getting Gen.G ended up getting a lead, such a big lead that they just were able to close it out. Some really bad decisions in team fights. Like, if I'm not remembering wrong, this was the game. Game two was where Gen.G chased the Kha'Zix. Yeah, they chased the Kha'Zix on Baron. Like, the one time they had map control, and then they chased Canyon to Timbuktu. They like followed him. They like got on a boat. Like Canyon's like, they're still after me, guys. Like just
Yeah.
surround them and kill them.
It's not only that, but Peanut was doing some. This is what I'm talking about, where Peanut will over pursue or tunnel on either somebody in a team fight or an objective on the map. And he will just, I mean, he went to Timbuktu against Canyon as he chased her around. But there's a dragon fight as well where Peanut, so Showmaker, who's playing Azir, right? So Showmaker ults, flashes, and shuffles out of a team fight and is almost dead. And instead of Peanut turning around and like killing Deft at that point in time, he proceeds to follow Azir into the jungle. Remember, Azir has nothing. Azir is not returning to this team fight, right? All abilities are down. Flash is gone. No ult. All he has to do is just let Showmaker walk away and go peel for Pei. So I don't want to really blame anything on like Pei's, like the Tristana pick here, because I feel that Peanut was oftentimes playing these team fights so badly on the Wukong that it wasn't really Pei's fault. Like Deft got to just walk up to him, right? Or he was kind of zoned out of an engagement. And a lot of that was like some really kind of poor team fighting by Peanut in game 2.
Yeah, and I think if you are going to play the Tristana pick, you really need to be extremely coordinated, and you need to be willing to make sure that everyone can play to get the Tristana those resets in team fights. And doesn't mean make sure you get the kill on champions that you find, because that can really backfire, as you've just outlined. But just making sure that you can protect him and allow him to then push forward into pushing those critical carries back, right? They got Showmaker out of that fight, but they're not able to get Deft. And yeah, it was a very messy game plan for Gen.G. And in terms of the draft, like you could tell the draft was prepared for the series. They're like, all right, we'll let Deft play Aphelios, and we'll push him onto that pick by with our bans, and then we'll have this Tristana response. Because at that moment in time, at that point in the week, everyone was saying like Aphelios Yuumi is basically unbeatable, and it was not being allowed to be played. We're seeing it banned a lot. We're seeing these picks taken away. And then they had the Tristana pick prepared for that in draft, but it didn't feel like they prepared for how to use it in the game itself. Like it didn't feel like the Quinn pick we saw from KT, where not only did they know it was a great lane counter and they had it prepared in draft, but then they played around it very well to make sure they didn't lose control and they could continue to win in late game team fights where Quinn is at her weakest. So it just felt like maybe, a little bit more scrim data was required on this one, or maybe a little bit more practice. Maybe they just thought we're the strong favorites here going into the series. And then after winning game 1, they're like, we'll run it back, we'll do it again, without realizing that I think the main reason why it worked so well in game 1 was because they got those skirmish kills and Pei's got ahead, kind of by Dplus's mistake rather than their proactive plays. I mean, I think I'm not trying to take anything away, but it felt like Dplus kind of messed that up, and then Pei's got fed, and then they were like, the Tristana worked, see?
Well, also, they had the Kazakhs in the first game of the series, and that was better suited to the skirmishes and getting some of these picks than the Wukong was. And as soon as you start to try and get into some of these team fights versus the Aphelios, Yuumi, and Azir and Gragas, you might have a very bad time with the Annie, Renekton, and Wukong, right? There's not the most synergy there, we'll say.
And the Wukong can't clear wards as quickly as the Kazakhs can, obviously, to control vision and try to set up for those explosive moments, because you don't have Umbroglaive. So, yeah, there were the Kazakhs we were, kind of looking at as the big focal point for those first 2 games, how much impact it had, even outside of, obviously, Peanut chasing the Kazakhs and the Kazakhs just jumping away. But just how much of a impact he can make vision-wise. It's kind of like the old Umbral Glaive Graves in terms of what he can do when you are ahead and how oppressive it can be.
Also, I think with Dplus, I mean, this was the complaint that we've had about them with this current roster, is that they seem like they're trying to do too much a lot of the time because they have these enormous champion pools. I mean, Canyon's already played 9 different junglers this split, including 2 games of Scion. Excuse me. 2 games of Scion. Xin Zhao, he's the only Xin Zhao player in the entire league. He's the only Nico player, even though his Nico game went really well. But it just seems to me that this roster from Dplus doesn't have they haven't figured out an identity to play this game yet that is very concrete. And so they're trying to just basically wing it every time they play a game. And sometimes it works out because of their individual skill, but it doesn't feel like they're all on the same page with win conditions and how they want to play a lot of the time.
And the one style that and identity I think they do have is playing through Deft's early game picks like the Lucian and the Draven, but that's banned against them so often now because they've found so much success with it, and teams have identified like this is where Deft seems most comfortable right now. And if Deft gets ahead and they get him into a position where he can carry, he does, right? So that win condition is a thing that teams are afraid of, and so thus they ban it away from him, and then he is pushed on to other picks. Because Aphelios actually looked pretty decent in that series. It wasn't about him, right? It wasn't his problem that the game wasn't going well. It's just his team didn't empower him, right? And it seems like Deft needs to be the main character, or else things just don't Kana and Canyon have been so inconsistent that if you're trying to play through Kana, if he's not on Renekton, I'm not ready to trust that it's going to be a good time. And then Canyon, he's had such high peaks, and he pioneered the Scion meta. I thought that was a great draft. It plays through Death Strengths, right? But if he's on something else and he has to kind of play reactionary to what's going on in the game and then play slow and then hope that Deft's going to scale, sometimes he just kind of runs it down. Like sometimes he actually tries to force a pick or hard gank or look for a pick right before an objective, and he ends up getting picked himself. Or he's trying to go deep on vision clear because he's like, we need to have this vision to win this team fight. I'm like, no, your comp actually should be able to win this team fight, even if you're pushing through a choke point because you have, the setup to front to back, for example, but he's going super deep and he gets caught a lot. And it feels like his mind, and maybe this is a shot calling problem, but like what he's thinking about doing and what he thinks is important and what gank he wants to go for, who he's ganking for, they're not on the same page. It almost feels like who he's ganking for is like, no, don't come here, Canyon. Like, I'm actually okay. Or stuff like that. Like, communication seems a little bit off on this roster. And when they're ahead, they look at their best, right? But if they're even or behind, it's not the same caliber of team as the rest of the top four, right? And we'll see if Dplus ends up staying in top four, as we finish the first round robin, because Hanwha might take that spot away from them. They're kind of in contention at this moment in time. They do play against each other, as mentioned. So it's going to be a really important matchup because right now I think Dplus is on the edge of like this team's mental might go boom because it's not a great start, and they already look like they're falling apart when they're falling behind in a best of three.
Yeah. Yeah, I think at least, they might have a little bit of time towards the end of the splits to regain their footing because their last, couple games are going to be against like Guangdong in the next couple weeks they play DRX and Guangdong, but they have to go through Hanwha Life and T1 first. So they basically have to play the four other best teams in the league back, in a row, which is very challenging for them. And while we're not going to read again too much into the Breon game that they had to play with the sub, and we don't know if Deft is still 100%. He certainly looked extremely good in the Nongshim game. So I think that, due to their individual abilities and their zany picks, they're going to be able to clap a lot of these rookie rosters. But when it comes to actually having super cohesive team play, that is where they've fallen apart. And, honestly, Wolf, at this point, I'm really wondering if this team that needs to be able to play through bot lane hyper carries in this meta to at least a serviceable degree, right? And when we talk about Deft, yeah, they can play through him when he's being a lane bully on Lucian or Draven, and that's a way you can win in this meta. That's for sure, right? But a lot of teams like the scaling insurance, like the ability to come from behind in the late game, and if you get an early advantage, well, then you're off to the races and you can snowball it very efficiently, right? And it just doesn't feel that Dplus knows how to do that. And if we talk about last year as well, they eventually got Noguri back, right? But he wasn't the same insane hyper carry top laner that he was before. And so Canyon and Showmaker as players seem to have never really been able to shake themselves out of, okay, we can play through each other and top lane, but can we actually, I mean, they had fucking Ghost and Barrel, right? And this was a very passive bot lane that was a very low economy bot lane that they basically never had to pay attention to. And maybe if they had a winning matchup, they could push through that. But when it comes to kind of propping Deft up and letting him be the star of the show and focus on peeling for him and playing conservatively in order to get him ahead or help him position in team fights, that's just not who they are. And at this point, I'm wondering if Canyon and Showmaker are ever going to be those guys.
Yeah. And I also don't, I mean, Kana, I think he can be. He isn't consistently right. He's somewhere to Doran in this respect, but like, I think if you tried to play through Kana more, it wouldn't always fall on its face. I know it's a scary prospect, and probably the coaching staff has decided like we're just not going to do this. Like we've tried it a few times, it's really fallen flat. We're not going to.
Well, I mean, they tried in that last game versus Gen.G with the Jax, where Canyon was just like set up a tent in top lane, right?
And I think that they can experiment with this more, especially when Deft is playing champions like Aphelios, or if he ends up playing the Zeri, because he can be very good in on his own, and he is very good at all-ins as well. Like Zeri has that level 6 all-in you can go for. Because I personally think that Deft with low resources can do well, but Dplus when he is having to sit back and wait for 2 items, they can't do well. And I think that says a lot more about the top half of the map than it does about Deft. But I'd like to see them try to play around Kana more, even though it might backfire. And I know everyone's calling for Thanatos. You're going to have to keep waiting on that one. I don't think Dplus has any intention of bringing him up at this point in time. You might see that next year, but what it does to a player's confidence, especially somebody like Kana who's already shaky, but that Thanatos is good, but he's good in challengers where the level of competition, by the way, is significantly lower, like massively lower. And I'm not saying it's like LCS levels of like, okay, like these 2 regions are completely different, but the level of play that you see, the coordination that's required, like Thanatos doesn't have a lot of experience right now. You put that guy into this team and they might like all lose their confidence very quickly. I personally think it's not a good idea right now, even though people think Kana has had such poor performances that it's warranted. I don't see it right now. Lucid as well, another player who's really good. I'd say Lucid is probably the best player in Challengers, period. But Canyon and Showmaker's synergy is already there. It's been there forever. Like you don't mess with that in the middle of a season. That's when you talk about like big changes to the team going forward. You could try it in a matchup against like Freon, although that ended up being a tough matchup for Dplus, so maybe not against that team. Maybe against like DRX or Nongshim, and see how it goes. But I don't think it's going to happen. I want to see them play around topside more, experiment with it a little bit, because if you're just going to be so one-dimensional and playing around Deft and his hard pushes, you just become so easy to draft against. And I think we saw that at the end of the spring season too. Or maybe Deft needs to practice Neela. Maybe he needs to play Callista. Maybe he needs to find other picks where he can have that same sort of early game impact. So when his Lucian and Draven are gone, he can still play other carries and they can actually funnel through him in a different way. Because there are more picks than just the Lucian and Draven that he can find success on. And we know that Dplus has historically been really smart in drafting, and they've had really unique picks. And maybe it's time to show some of those and try to double down on Deft in a different way. Otherwise, I think we have to go back and maybe allow Deft to play a little more weak side, try to push that top side advantage. Because right now, the way they're doing it is predictable. And it's not even, and when they even get those picks for Deft, it's not working out a lot of the time either.
Yeah. And moving over to Gen.G for our final topic on the show, they are well on their way to an undefeated first round robin, right? Their one hurdle left is going to be Hanwha Life, which we would expect them to beat. But it's not that, for a team that may well be undefeated in best of threes halfway through the splits, it doesn't feel like this team is really the king, right? It doesn't feel like Gen.G from summer of last year. It doesn't feel like that amazing run that T1 had in the regular season of spring here in 2023, because there have been a lot of flaws. Like they've played close series versus KT, T1, and Dplus KIA. They probably should have lost at least one of those. They were bolstered by the static Shiv buy from aiming in the KT series. They almost threw away the win against T1. And yeah, their record does not reflect necessarily the level of dominance you would anticipate from the eye test from watching their games, where Doran has had some really shaky moments, right, in the laning phase in particular, even though he has had some good team fighting, even when he has a shaky laning phase. Like we said, they have had a tendency to over pursue at times and throw games or team fight rather poorly. And that is concerning if you are a Gen.G fan.
I think there's other factors as well. Like, for example, when T1 was going through their dominant era, they were like breaking records. And then in the last season, obviously, even though they didn't ultimately win, they were pushing the meta. You know, the marksman support. We also had, Faker being the first person to play mid Gragas, for example, when they were prioritizing that pick super early. And you felt like inspired by what the top team was doing, and you were like, "Wow, this is clearly the top team. Everyone is copying this team. Everyone wants to be this team, and they have a dominant record." And then you look at Gen.G this time, you don't see that with the eye test. You don't see unique drafting. You don't see anything stand out except Pays, right? Who seems to be the best AD carry and is playing incredibly well. Like, in Chovy's being consistent, right? You're a little bit worried about what's going on with Doran. You're a little bit worried about what's going on with Peanut. But you know that, like, they'll play through Pays and they'll be fine. And I think when you look at Gen.G being the top team, you're like, it means if you think, like, I think if you watch this and you think clearly Gen.G is the top team, it means you don't trust KT. It means that you think T1 is in a slump right now, and that you're like, yeah, Gen.G is the best because all these other teams are worse than them, rather than Gen.G is the best because they're clearly the best. I think that's kind of like how you're turning your cogs in your brain if you're thinking like Gen.G is definitely the best team right now. I think a lot of people are not ready to trust Gen.G because we have seen, if you've been watching LCK for a long time, like in the post-OGN era, we have seen very dominant starts from Gen.G where they're first in the standings and they bomb in playoffs, or they choke in playoffs, they lose to T1, right? T1 ends up pushing ahead and actually going to the finals instead of them, or beating them in the finals, right? So we've seen this happen before where Gen.G is looking dominant and then they can't cross the finish line when it matters most. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case here, but I do think with how good KT is right now and how good or how Gen.G's form is right now, I think we need to see some of those weaknesses shored up, because eventually I think teams are going to pass them, especially potentially KT, if Gen.G just kind of stay where they are. I think we need to see them continue to improve, and I think Doran's form is one of the biggest looks we have to look at right now. And it's usually been Doran is great until he goes like 0-1 in a series. Then he starts to mess it up. Then he starts to choke. But now it's just kind of like somewhat random when Doran is going to make big mistakes. And we know how good he can be. See LCK Spring Finals for 2023. I just hope he bounces back, because it feels frustrating to watch a team like this be so held down by sometimes random overextensions. And like, Doran gets solo killed a lot by failing attempted solo kills. Like, it's actually usually he who fails, right? It's not
true.
like he's actually good. It's not like people are just dunking on him. He's like accidentally dying.
In the game against Kana, like, why does he need to slice under the tower and then just get soloed and like cast under the tower? And like the thing about Doran though is, yeah, he died stupidly that way in game number 1 versus Dplus, but then he comes back, doesn't die for the rest of the game, and actually has some really good Renekton plays and team fights, right? So he follows the rest of his team, and he is on the priority targets when it comes to the actual team fighting. But the problem is that very good top laners, especially Kiin or ones from LPL, with the way that players like Bin and 369 are playing right now in the LPL, he's not going to come back from that. You know what I mean? Like, that's the issue, is that it feels like he's getting away with this bullshit domestically, but against really good tops and from China, that just won't happen.
Yeah, no. It's not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen against Kiin the next time they meet if he messes it up, So it's a problem you can't really solve as Gen.G at the moment. Like, I'm like thinking about their challengers roster. I'm like, nope, that's definitely, it's not gonna happen. You're not gonna send Zest in. He's not gonna fix that for you right now. And it's the thing is, Doran is clutch oftentimes outside of lane, and he will warp team fights for you. So like, you want to trust in him too. Like, and I would not want to be score right now, like being like, Doran, please just don't int, man. Like, don't actually die. Like, don't troll us, man.
Please.
Like, we can win this, and like, you're just like making it hard, you know. But we could do this. Like, can you just be stable up there? But like in fairness though, it's like not always just Doran. Sometimes it's the decision making. So Peanut, Chovy is, you know, he's very on form right now, but he is also not playing the same sort of facilitating role that BDD is, and that Faker still often is. So this team might just be trapped in an older meta, and they need to figure out how to get out of it and be willing to play more picks. And then maybe Doran can find his way, his niche in that. But I mean, I'm not trying to say like it's doom and gloom for our undefeated team.
No, it's still a very good
but I
team.
think it's not going to stay undefeated. I don't think this team is going for the perfect record. I think they probably will get the first round robin. As like you said, the toughest opponent left for them is Hanwha. But I mean, even if T1 regain their form, then they might be better than Gen.G as well. You know, like I think Gen.G really just need to step it up and be consistent. That series against Dplus really made me feel this way more than anything else. Like where we saw some really bad decision making overall in that series.
Yeah.
That was the one where like all of the casters were like looking at each other going like, so KT is the best team in our region, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think on this patch, that at least is true, at least for the moment. All right, guys, that'll do it for the Monte and Wolf Show for this week. Again, next week we'll be putting a spotlight onto Hanwha because they play Dplus and GenG. T1 also gets to play Dplus next week, so we've got quite a few of these good games, and that will be you know, towards the end. All teams will have played 8 games at that point as of the end of next week. So it'll be right towards the end of that first round robin of play. And we can kind of evaluate where we see playoffs going. So we'll see you next week.